Last week's lecture, we focused a little bit on aspects of the work environment and how that impacts the development of adolescence and emerging adulthood. During this lecture, we're going to dive into that topic in a little bit more detail. We'll look specifically at how work during this period differs in traditional and Western cultures, before diving into what work looks like in today's society, as well as the process of choosing a job. And then we'll quickly end by talking about, of course, emerging adulthood. So, as a brief reminder, traditional cultures have a very different impact on the development of adolescence and emerging adulthood compared to Western or more modern cultures, globalized cultures. And as we've talked about in the past, adolescents in traditional cultures spend a great deal more of their time engaging in these types of tasks: hunting, fishing, gathering, farming, domestic animal care, child care, house care, and other similar pastimes. While these are a much more normal or normative part of traditional cultures, they are still considered work. So, as another reminder, we know that in traditional cultures, adolescents spend much more time working, especially females. We talked in the past about how males have more access to education while females tend to stop attending school sooner and start taking over some of these work activities. But regardless of gender, we know that much of adolescence in traditional cultures is spent engaging in work. The types of work is gender specific, of course, with females being involved more in childcare and housework, as well as some gathering depending on the culture, and males being more involved in hunting, fishing, farming, and animal care. I also want to remind you that we talked about traditional cultures, or in traditional cultures, how hunting and gathering and fishing is a mark of manhood. So for men specifically, transitioning into the workforce for traditional cultures is not just a financial or domestic aspect of their life, but rather an extremely important social aspect of their development as well. Looking at Western cultures, of course, we see some stark differences. We know that, especially, or at least in most Western cultures, school is required, as we talked about last week. However, about 80% of high schoolers do hold some sort of job at some point during their high school experience. We know that engaging in part-time work does have an impact on the educational experience, as we talked about last week. But today I want to focus more on the work-specific aspects of this aspect of development. We know that in terms of developed countries or Western countries, westernized countries, and some Eastern developed countries, American teenagers actually work much more than their other cultured peers. We know that a big part of this has to do with other cultures having longer school days and requiring more homework. American teens are in school less and tend to have less homework, which frees up more time for them to go to work. So this is, in some ways, a unique aspect of American culture or American society, even though teenagers across the world, of course, do engage in some work. Much higher percentages for us. So let's talk about what types of jobs adolescents tend to have. During early adolescence, roughly ages 12 to 15, we know that most girls, or the most common job for girls, is babysitting, and the most common job for boys is yard work, things like mowing the grass and hauling for neighbors and friends and things along those lines. As we transition into older adolescence, the most common jobs become restaurant work and retail work. I was involved in both babysitting and restaurant work during adolescence, and I'm sure many of you followed these trends as well. We know that in addition to changes in the types of jobs that are commonly held, older adolescents tend to spend much more time at work than their younger peers. In fact, the average junior spends 15 hours a week working, while the average senior spends 20 hours a week working. Some other common jobs for teenagers, we mentioned restaurants and retail work. We also see clerical work and some degree of skilled labor. However, manual labor is much more common. So, the overall trend that we're seeing here is teenagers engaging in a lot of repetitive and monotonous tasks, carrying things, crunching numbers, doing things over and over and over again without a lot of opportunity to develop skills. So let's look at the effect that that has on our psychological functioning. And I want to start by talking about the amount of time spent at work. Again, we briefly mentioned the 10-hour week cutoff last week, but we want to look a little bit more at that. We know that teenagers who work 10 hours or less don't show any consistent negative outcomes when it comes to their schoolwork or overall psychological functioning. But teenagers who work 10 or more hours a week are at a higher risk of depression and anxiety. They tend to sleep less. They also tend to show worse health behaviors, eating and exercise habits, as well as worse performance at school. However, there are some benefits to working as well, especially when the type of work allows them to develop new skills. When we are developing new skills, we actually see an increase in overall well-being. A big part of that comes from boosts in self-esteem as the teenager develops their own skills, gets better at things, starts to feel accomplished, and better overall life satisfaction. So it does seem like while the hour cutoff, 10 hours or more, is important and can have a very real effect, the quality and the type of work that an individual is doing also matters. And that's important when we know that so many teenagers only engage in repetitive, monotonous tasks at work. Working less than 10 hours a week can boost a teenager's sense of responsibility, their financial abilities, not just their financial situation. Earning your own money increases your responsibility, your financial skills, and so on and so forth. But we also know that working as a teenager can be beneficial for social skills, as well as teaching time management, teaching specific occupational skills, of course, and it can actually help teenagers develop beneficial or helpful, healthy relationships with adults. And that can be particularly important for teenagers who don't have those relationships in other areas of their life. However, regardless of the overall trends that we see related to timing of work and some of those positive impacts on overall well-being, we know that there is an increase in specific types of problem behaviors once teenagers start working. One area of that plays off that 10-hour or more week. We know that in addition to those negative outcomes we talked about previously, we see higher rates of drug and alcohol use for teenagers who work more than 10 hours. And there's a lot of data to suggest that that comes from increased stress. The stress of having to deal with school and working long hours can actually lead to drug and alcohol use. But we also see an increase in something called occupational deviance. Occupational deviance is a behavior that is done at work or relating to work that can negatively impact the work environment. For example, stealing, calling in sick when you're not actually sick, not following all of the instructions for cleaning tables at work, and all those different things that we can do to kind of put our working relationships or our standing with our workplace at risk. We know that 60% of adolescent workers actually report engaging in occupational deviance, so it's very common. However, much of this behavior isn't necessarily something to be concerned about. Again, we're talking about things like calling in sick when you're not sick. Some adults do that as well. We're not just talking about very deviant behavior. And we also know that the occurrence of occupational deviance actually increases when teenagers are bored or when they're not benefiting or being stimulated by their job, when they see their work as pointless. Now I want to take a step away from looking at different types and outcomes of work and focus specifically on how we transition from part-time work to full-time work once we finish high school or secondary school. We know that the way our economy works right now has caused a big shift in what this transition looks like. In the past, many of the jobs that adolescents and young adults could seek after high school involved manufacturing. But with advancements in technology, manufacturing jobs are not very common anymore. We have what we now call a knowledge economy. And unfortunately, we know that schools don't necessarily do a great job preparing high school students for that knowledge economy. So what we end up seeing a lot of the time is people graduating from high school without having the skills necessary to be successful in the current economy that we have. So I want to take a second and mention some programs that we have active in the country right now that do allow for better transition to full-time work. Although it's uncommon, we do have apprenticeships in our country where you can see somebody working under an administrative or office technician, a healthcare professional, and sometimes even manufacturing and engineering jobs. We'll talk more about that in a second. What I also want to mention are formalized programs that we have that have been shown to benefit adolescents and emerging adults. The first one is something called Job Corps, which is a government-run program that trains teenagers or young adults for jobs in the government. We also have an organization called Youth Build that focuses on skills like building and renovation and teaches children, or rather teenagers, these skills while they're finishing up their high school experience. So they're maintaining their education, they're graduating, but at the same time, they're also spending a big part of their time building these very useful skills. These programs have been met with some success, but unfortunately, they're not readily available to many people in the country. I said that we would focus a little bit more on apprenticeship. If you're unfamiliar with that term, an apprenticeship is when a novice or a new worker works underneath a person who's already established in their field, an experienced worker, and that person kind of mentors them and teaches them the skills necessary to succeed in that job. This is actually very common in Western Europe, but not very common at all in America. We know that in Western Europe, apprenticeships actually capture many of those students who choose not to attend college after secondary school or high school, and gives them a really great option to develop themselves and progress in a career of their choosing without having to go to college, while still allowing them time to finish up their education. So we know that typically apprenticeship starts around the age of 16 and lasts 2 to 3 years. So while they're learning these skills, they are continuing their education. They're also trained in the active workplace, so their mentorship happens at the place of work. And they're also earning money. Not necessarily the same amount of money they'll be earning after they finish their apprenticeship, but what we have here is kind of a three-pronged approach to job transitioning. You're maintaining your education, you're learning beneficial skills, and you're also earning money. This can be a great system, especially for people who are interested in careers where college might not be the best option or make the most sense for them. Now what we want to look at is the process we go through when it comes to choosing what career we want to pursue. As we've mentioned, this is a big transitional period, and a lot of that transition comes from becoming more and more realistic about what your career options are and what you want that career to look like. As we grow up, as we move through adolescence, teenagers become aware that their decisions have a long-term impact on their life. So, choosing a career in adolescence starts with something called the crystallization phase. And this is the bulk of our adolescent years, where we move from those fantasies we had as children. I want to be an astronaut. I want to save the world. I want to be a rock star. To considering our actual interests and skills. Thinking about what am I good at and what do I like to do. This goes hand in hand with the identity development that we've talked about previously. From age 18 to roughly 21, we experience something called specification, where I have an idea of what I'm interested in and what I'm good at, and I need to spend some time seeking out information, learning as much as I can so I can make very specific career choices. This is when we often spend a significant portion of our time training and or being educated in the field. And of course, this is the traditional college age population or emerging adulthood. After that, we move into the implementation phase, typically when we're completing our education and training. That is when we have to resolve those last discrepancies between reality, what's actually going to happen, and what our goals are. You might learn that you don't have the necessary background to ever do a specific aspect of that job. You might learn that, hey, I really wanted to be a doctor, but I just can't afford medical school, so I'm going to become a physician's assistant instead. And you start pursuing that very specific job that's going to fit with your interests, your skills, and the reality of your situation. After that, we move into stabilization, where you're starting to establish yourself in your career. You get your foot in the door, you start working, and you gain a lot of stability, especially when it comes to that career path you've chosen, where you're established, you're actually building and working towards something and gaining a ton of experience. You're still the new person, the novice, the youngest person at the company, whatever it may be, but you're rapidly getting better and better. From there, we move into the last phase of career development called consolidation, where I'm continuing to develop experience and expertise, but I've started advancing in my career, moving higher up the ladder. An interesting aspect of career choice that we want to mention is the relationship between personality and the careers that we choose. Because of course, as we mentioned with the stages of career choice development, what we are like, what we're interested in, what skills we naturally have play a role. And a big part of that comes down to personality. And I want to show you this one theory that actually breaks people down into different personality types and illustrates the careers that tend to work best with those types. Type number 1 is the realistic type. These people are strong and practical, but tend to have lower social skills. Realistic individuals tend to be better at physical labor, things like farming, truck driving, construction, and so on and so forth. Next, we have the investigative person. People who are very conceptual and use a lot of theoretical reasoning skills, but also might not necessarily have the social skills necessary to enjoy other specific types of careers. Investigative people tend to be good at math and science. And then we have social individuals, people with high verbal and social skills, tend to make good teachers, social workers, counselors, etc., etc. Now, I want to mention here that it is possible to fall into multiple categories here. For example, many psychologists are scientists and counselors. They're investigative, but also socially skilled. So we're not just limited to one category, of course. Next, we have a conventional personality type. These people tend to have a strong drive for structure and direction. They like to have rules to follow and know exactly what to do, have a clear-cut picture of their responsibilities, but aren't necessarily interested in leadership. These individuals tend to succeed at jobs like being a bank teller or secretary, administrative or executive assistants. Next, we have enterprising personality types with high verbal abilities, high social skills, and good leadership. These individuals tend to choose careers involving sales, politics, management, entrepreneurship, and things along that line. We, of course, also have the artistic personality type. These people tend to be very introspective, imaginative, and creative, and as you might guess, make great artists and writers, musicians, things like that. As I mentioned, the last thing we want to talk about in this chapter are some specific aspects of emerging adulthood itself. As we've talked about in the past, identity is a critical feature of the transitional period that is emerging adulthood. And I want to reiterate that the career choices we make are going to be strongly impacted by the exploration we're doing to further our identity development. Part of what we're doing during emerging adulthood is answering these three questions. What am I good at? What do I like? And what do I want? And we have to find a way to make the answers to all of these three questions work together. In order to know how to answer these questions, we have to have a strong understanding of who we are. Hopefully that outlines the importance of exploration and identity development when it comes to career choices. And I want to point out that this process isn't simple. It's not short. It's not something that happens quickly and can in fact take several years. The average 18 to 30-year-old actually has 10 jobs over that 12-year period, where we're trying a lot of different things. Some researchers describe this period of early adulthood as meandering, drifting, and floundering. Kind of wandering around, exploring, trying new things, trying on different careers to see what works best for you. We know that some emerging adults have a much more structured, logical path that they follow to career development, but many do not. We know that people who have a systematic approach, again, they have a plan, they follow a specific course, rather than just kind of randomly wandering around trying to figure out what to do tend to have happier career outcomes earlier in life. But that floundering process, that meandering, can actually promote stronger identity development. So the goal here, I think, is to get the best of both worlds. Apply logic, be realistic, but also allow yourself room to explore and develop your own identity. I want to end by quickly mentioning unemployment because, unfortunately, that is not an uncommon problem, even for emerging adulthood. In case you're unaware, unemployment means specifically an individual who is not in school, not working, but is looking for a job. So if someone is not interested in working and not pursuing a job, they're actually not considered unemployed. Unfortunately, we know that unemployment rates are very high for high school dropouts. Again, a lot of careers in our country right now require degrees and or skills that we don't necessarily develop in high school. Unfortunately, we see high rates of unemployment specifically during emerging adulthood, and that does contribute to higher rates of depression. A big cause of this is the lack of manufacturing jobs. I mentioned the knowledge economy we have earlier. That makes it hard to find a job when you don't have those things that employers are looking for. So hopefully we can find a way to address this issue in our population moving forward, where we maybe draw on programs like apprenticeships, where we teach skills, where we make it easier for high schoolers under certain stressful situations to stay in school, to do what they need to do to be successful in the workplace. That brings me to the end of the lecture. As always, please reach out if you have any questions.